Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming. Good to see everyone. I am Professor Philip Harold, Associate Dean of the School of Education and Social Sciences and Professor of Political Science here at Robert Morris University. And I want to welcome everyone to this symposium on the 2016 presidential election. We just finished up an election last night, so here bright and early, we're talking about next year's election. That's how we do things in the United States. So welcome to all of you here on campus and to the viewers on PCN. This presidential election has already been filled with surprises and drama. We've been following this here at Robert Morris through our polling institute, which we've done a lot of interesting polls. You can find them at rmu.edu/poll, including political polls and including the presidential race. So we had one back in May. It was early. We were looking at who Democrats and Republicans could support. We're sitting around scratching our heads, thinking about who to include on this list. We came up with 20 candidates on the Republican side. And we found there was a top tier of Jeb Bush, Scott Walker, and Marco Rubio. The one person we didn't put on the list of 20 candidates is now at the top of the pack, Donald Trump. And at the bottom of the second tier was Ben Carson, who is now also at the top of the pack with Donald Trump. So my, how things change. A day is a lifetime in presidential politics, as the adage goes. That's certainly true. And things will continue to change in the future. So today we're going to look at that, about what's coming up, what we can expect. And I want to give you a quote from Alexis de Tocqueville back in 1835 of what presidential elections in the United States are like. He writes this: "One may consider the time of a presidential election as a moment of national crisis. Intrigues grow more active, and agitation is more lively and wider spread. The whole nation gets into a feverish state. The election is the daily theme of comments in the newspapers and private conversation, the object of every action, and the subject of every thought, and the sole interest for the moment. It is true that as soon as fortune has pronounced, the order is dissipated, everything calms down, and the river which momentarily overflowed its banks falls back to its bed. But was it not astonishing that such a storm could have arisen?" So this is what we have to look forward to with the presidential election, a fevered state of agitation and crisis. So with that, I'll welcome you to the symposium, and I'll introduce our first speaker, Dr. Heather Rice, who is an assistant professor of political science at Slippery Rock University. She got her PhD from the University of Pittsburgh with specialties in American politics and political behavior, and has published and given presentations on the US judicial system and public opinion. And today she starts out our symposium by talking about the mechanics of how we elect a president, the Electoral College. Dr. Rice, thank you.
Hi there. I'd like to thank you all for having me here. Dr. Harold, thank you very much for thinking of me, contacting me, and I'd like to thank all of you students for coming. It's very nice to see you all here. I'm going to attempt to use this microphone. I feel very important. I've never had to do this, so it should be kind of interesting. In one hand, I'm going to have the microphone, and in the other, I'll have my clicker, so we'll see how this goes. So today what I'm talking about, I'm going to talk all about the Electoral College. And so my goal by the end of my 45 minutes here is to have you to understand the basic mechanics of the Electoral College. I want you to also be able to understand some of the complications that arise from the Electoral College. And third, I want you to have an idea about some of the potential reforms that people have proposed for the Electoral College, given those complications. So first, I always like to start at the very beginning. And so the very beginning, when we're talking about the Electoral College, is the Constitution. And so it's important to remember that whenever the framers of the Constitution were trying to craft the second article of the Constitution, the presidency, they had a significant amount of trouble, right? They'd had some experience under a king in the colonies. They'd had an experience with no federal executive under the Articles of Confederation. And so whenever the framers of the Constitution were trying to come up with the presidency in the new Constitution, they had a lot of trouble. And so one of the big troubles that they had was how to choose that president. Okay, how to choose that president. And so there were a number of proposals. Some within the country thought that Congress should be responsible for choosing the president, that the president should be one of the members of Congress. This was one of the proposals. There were other segments within society that thought that the president instead should be chosen by the states. We are the United States of America. After all, the states are arguably the most important unit of analysis. And so there were some segments of society that thought that the states should be responsible for choosing the president. And then there was another segment of society that thought that the citizens should be responsible for choosing the president, that citizens should have a say on who the chief executive for the nation would be. Now, you have these three very divergent positions, three options, and the framers had to decide between these three what to do, and they realized that they couldn't choose just one. And so the solution that they come up with is a compromise, and that compromise they devise is the Electoral College. So what is the Electoral College? Now, you all are college students, so you might be thinking that the Electoral College is a place, but in actuality, the Electoral College is not a place, it's a process. So the Electoral College is the process through which the President of the United States is elected. That's it. Okay, that's the basic idea, that the Electoral College is the process through which we elect a president. Now, remember, you had the framers of the Constitution, they had to come up with a compromise. This is their compromise. And so the elements, the specific elements of the Electoral College involve elements of states having a say, Congress having a say, and citizens having a say. And so the specifics of the Electoral College. First, the Electoral College is basically a group of people who are called electors, and these electors are appointed by each state. So here the state is having a role. Okay, so the Electoral College is simply the process through which we select the president. And the specific elements, first, a group of people called electors. They're appointed by each state, and those specific electors have one vote. Each elector has one vote, and they are responsible for electing the president. So this is your element of the state. The second element, or the second part of the Electoral College, is that a state's total number of electors, okay, so the state's total number of electors is equal to its congressional delegation. So this is the Congress piece, okay? So Congress, the total members of Congress, total number of senators and members in the House of Representatives, that number is the total number of electors that each state has. Okay, so we have first the state piece, that the state chooses the electors. The electors, the total number of electors that each state has, and each state has a different number of total electors and votes, and we'll get to that in a minute. And then the third piece is that citizens play a role, but citizens do not directly elect the president. So what I mean by that is whenever you go and vote, all right, so let's pretend, we'll fast forward a year, and just like we heard Dr. Harold talk about, he's talking about the front runners. So on the Republican side, right now, I saw last night that the number one front runner is now Ben Carson. So if we are fast forwarding a year and the current front runners are the actual nominees that we see on the ballot, okay? So we have on the Republican side, Ben Carson. On the Democratic side, we see Hillary Clinton. Whenever you are placing your vote, you go into the ballot booth, you see the names, and you place your vote. Now we have touch screens, you touch the screen. It's important that you know that you are not directly electing the president. So whenever you are voting, you're not actually voting directly for Hillary Clinton or directly for Ben Carson. Instead, what you're saying is, I want the electors from my state. I want the electors from my state in Pennsylvania. I want them, those votes, to go to the candidate that I'm selecting. So you are not directly choosing or voting for the president. You are indirectly voting for the president. You are voting for the electors who then ultimately place the votes for the president. So three elements, right? So you had the three elements of society. You had some who thought that the states should choose the president, some that chose that the Congress should choose the president, and others who thought that the citizens should choose the president. So what we have with the Electoral College is a process where we select the president that has each of those three elements within it. Do you see that? Yes. Yes. Okay, good. So let's go back to the second piece, the total number of electors that each state gets. So each state has a specific number of electors, and this varies from state to state. So the total number of electors and electoral votes varies from state to state. So let's take this equation, which is how we determine the total number of electors and the total number of electoral votes that each state gets. This is the basic equation. That in each state, the total number of electoral votes is equal to the number of senators plus the total number of House reps within the state. Okay? So the congressional delegation, total number of members in Congress. Now let's use an example to make sure that we all understand this process. So we all are here in Pennsylvania. Yes. How many senators does the state of Pennsylvania have? 2. 2 senators, state of Pennsylvania. Oops, excuse me. You just saw that. Pretend that you didn't see that. How many members in the House do we have in Pennsylvania? 18. Okay, right now we are actually sitting in the 18th congressional district. This is the last congressional district. So we have 18 representatives in the House from Pennsylvania. So the total number of electoral votes that the state of Pennsylvania gets is equal to the number of senators plus the number of reps in the House. And so 2 plus 18 equals 20. Okay, so Pennsylvania, we have 20 electoral votes. We have 20 electors from the state of Pennsylvania. Let's take a different state, a bigger state, California. This is the most highly populated state in our country. How many senators does the state of California have? 2. Okay, it doesn't matter population. Every single state gets 2 senators. Now, I don't expect you to know this, so I'll just tell you. Did you know it? I'm sorry. Sorry. I took away your thunder. Okay, so California has 53 representatives in the House. And so the state of California has a total number of electoral votes that's equal to 55. So what happens whenever we determine the total number of electoral votes that ultimately can choose the president, we do this process for each and every state. You do this process for each and every state. You can come up with a total number of electoral votes by simply using this equation. And so if we were to do this, so we take Pennsylvania's 20 electoral votes, we would add it to California's 55 electoral votes, and then we would take all of the 50 states, Alabama, Alaska, Arizona, Arkansas, so on and so forth. And then we add DC because they get 3 as well, thanks to the 23rd Amendment, okay? Whenever we do this addition, we add all of the states' electoral votes together. Their total number is 538. There are 538 total electoral votes that are available. So there are 333 million Americans. Of that, the total voting age population is something like 240 million. But the only votes that matter are these 538. Okay? So this is what it looks like when you look at the electoral votes across the states. This is the blank electoral map. So if you were to do the math that we just did for both Pennsylvania and California, if you were to do this for all of the states, this is what you would see. Now I want to point out one specific thing that will come back later. First, you might notice here, out in Montana, the Dakotas, Wyoming, this area out here is sparsely populated, but each state is guaranteed at least 3 electoral votes. Why? 2 senators for every state, plus at least 1 congressional district. So every single state, even the small ones, like Wyoming only has 500,000 citizens, the whole state, they still get 3 electoral votes. Okay? So the general map. Now, how do you win the presidency? So now we understand, number 1, how the Electoral College came about as a compromise. Now we understand the specifics of the total number of electoral votes. So the next thing we need to discuss is how do you actually win the presidency? So we have 538 total electors, 538 total electoral votes. And so the way that you win the presidency, first, is that citizens go and they vote, and then each state's electoral votes are awarded on a winner-take-all basis. Okay, what that means is that whenever we go to vote, so next year we go to vote, we place our vote choice. Let's say you choose Hillary Clinton next year. When you're saying, I want Hillary Clinton to receive the 20 electoral votes from the state of Pennsylvania, all of the citizens in the rest of the country, they go through, they do the same thing. If Hillary Clinton wins more than any other candidate in the individual state, then Hillary Clinton receives all of the electoral votes from that state. It doesn't matter if Hillary wins by 1 vote. It doesn't matter if she wins by 500. It doesn't matter if she wins by 1,000,000 votes. As long as a candidate gets more than any other in a state, then that candidate receives all of the electoral votes from that state. Okay? 2 exceptions to this process. Maine and Nebraska. Maine and Nebraska do this slightly different. Now, instead of the candidates winning all of the electoral votes within the state, okay, if Hillary wins more than anybody else in Pennsylvania, she receives all 20 of the electoral votes. Maine and Nebraska, they give their electoral votes from within congressional districts. Okay, so citizens, we go to vote, and then each congressional district has an electoral vote that is assigned to it. And so the candidate that wins the popular vote, so more than anybody else within each congressional district, receives the electoral vote from that district. Yeah? Then there's a second piece to this. Okay, so Maine and Nebraska, they choose their electoral, they assign their electoral votes within congressional districts, but as you know, there are 2 electoral votes that are assigned statewide to the senators. And so what happens in Maine and Nebraska, the candidate that wins more than any other statewide receives those 2 additional electoral votes. So it's possible in Maine and Nebraska for one candidate to receive 1 electoral vote and another candidate to receive 2 or 3. I guess it's really 3 or 4, taking the states. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, so the second piece here. So first, the way that electoral votes are awarded. That's the first element. Second element is that the person who wins the Electoral College, right, the person who wins the presidency, is the candidate who receives at least 270 of the 538 electoral votes. The 270 represents a majority, slightly, 50.19%. So the candidate to receive 270 electoral votes is the candidate that becomes president. Good? You're a quiet group. Did you not have your breakfast? What's the deal? Okay, so what we have here is the electoral totals from the 2012 election. Okay, this is what you see on election night. Now, on election night, you probably have seen this map, and then as polls close, you see this map lighting up red and blue, right? Red is if a candidate, if the Republican wins the state, and therefore the Republican candidate wins all of the electoral votes. State lights up blue if the Democrats win the state, and therefore the Democratic candidate receives the electoral votes for that state. So this is that map simply filled in from 2012. And so what you see here at the top, this is President Obama. You might recognize him. Okay, President Obama, in 2012, he received 332 electoral votes. So he exceeded that 270 by 62. He had 62 extra electoral votes. On the right, you have the Republican candidate, Mitt Romney, and he received 206. Now, from these numbers, it looks an awful lot like President Obama slaughtered Mitt Romney, yes? Looks like a slam dunk win for President Obama. And that's true whenever you look at the Electoral College map. But whenever you break it down by the popular vote, so the total number of votes that were cast in the United States overall, what you find is that President Obama received 51.1% and Romney received 47.2% of the vote. So the Electoral College, the point I'm trying to make here is that the Electoral College can skew the results that you see nationwide. Okay? And so the Electoral College, what it also it it causes candidates to have very clear political strategies to try to craft a map that puts together at least 270 votes. Now, you might be thinking, okay, the obvious choice is to try to target these states with large populations, right? You might think that that is the most obvious choice. California has 55 electoral votes, Texas has 38, Florida and New York have 29. So you might be thinking, okay, the obvious strategy then should be for a candidate to target these states that have large populations. And you would be half right. You would be half right. Now, what actually happens is that we know, looking at this map, we know thinking about the future next year, we know that there are some states that just actually are not competitive. And the states that are actually not competitive are called safe states. Safe states. Now, safe states are those in which the presidential vote outcome is a given. It's a given. So right now, we don't even know who the candidates will be for the Democrats or for the Republicans, but we know that there are a certain set of states that are definitely going to go for the Democrats and a certain number of states that are definitely going to go for the Republicans, no matter who the candidate is, no matter who. And we know this based on two specific pieces of information. We know it first based on historical voting patterns. So we can use what happened in the past to inform us about the future. Yeah? So we can use the map from 2012 to inform us about how the Electoral College map will look in 2016. History tells us a lot, right? If a state has voted for the Democratic candidate in the last 6 presidential elections, it's pretty clear that they're probably going to continue this pattern. So history tells us a lot about the future. The second piece of information that gives us an idea about these safe states are the voter registration rolls. So there are some states where the majority of voters, the majority of people who are registered within states, is just overwhelming compared to the other party. So we know, based on both historical voting patterns, so previous presidential election returns, as well as voter registration rolls, we can use these two pieces of information to tell us which states are safe and which states are competitive. Now, those competitive states are like the cream of the crop. This is where all of the action happens. And so these states are called battleground or swing states. The two terms are used interchangeably. Now, the battleground or swing states are simply the states where the presidential vote, it could go either way. So maybe in the past few elections, they voted for Republicans the last time, the Republican presidential nominee. The presidential election before that, they went for the Democrats. Before that, Republicans. Before that, Dems. And so these states, there's no obvious outcome. And like I said, this is where the real action occurs. Now, there are some people, I'll get back to that. Now, there are some people in my field, in the media, who try to forecast elections. So this is the first guess at what the electoral map will look like next year. Okay, this is the first cut. And so what you see here in blue, all the states that are in blue, are the safe states for the Democrats. So right now, we don't know who the candidates are. We have no idea who the candidates are. I suppose we have some idea, but we don't know for sure who the candidates will be. And already a year out, we have an idea about which states will go for the Democrats no matter what, which states will go for the Republicans no matter who's running. And then these states that are the yellow, right, these states in the yellow, there are 7 of them: Nevada, Colorado, Iowa, Ohio, Virginia, Florida, and New Hampshire. Okay, these states are the battleground states. So right now, what you see a year out, this was released in August 2015, a year out, you see that the Democrats are basically guaranteed 247 electoral votes. So that means that any Democratic candidate will only need to muster up, 23 more electoral votes in order to win the presidency. So from these 7 states, whoever the Democratic candidate is, will have to get at least 23 of these electoral votes. So it could take just Florida. It could take a combination of Ohio and Iowa, Ohio and Nevada. For the Republicans, their map looks a little different. So right now, we can basically say that the Republicans, the safe states, give the Republicans 206 electoral votes. So they have a little more work to do, right? 64 electoral votes. And so they need to be able to piece together some combination of these 7 states that brings them 64 electoral votes. Yeah? So let's go back to the idea of the strategy. So the strategy you might have thought was to target the largest states, the states with the largest number of electoral votes. That's not true. Instead, what happens is all of the attention, or almost all of the attention, goes to these 7 states, these battleground states. Yeah? You want to target the ones that have the most, right? More bang for your buck if you target Florida. Okay? Okay, so this raises, we've gone all the way through the Electoral College. Now, this mechanism, this process through which we elect the president, raises some complications, I call them, complications of the Electoral College. The first is that some states get completely ignored, while the battleground states, the swing states, get all of the attention. So in 2004, in the 2004 election time, I was a senior at Clemson University. Clemson University, we just were ranked #1 in college football. Thank you very much. So I was at Clemson, South Carolina. And in South Carolina, if we look back to our map here, South Carolina is basically like the safest Republican state that there is. It's one of the safest Republican states that there is. And so whenever I was a college student, I did not change my voter registration. I'm from Pennsylvania. I'm actually from Pittsburgh. And so in 2004, Pennsylvania was a pretty big battleground state. It was a pretty big deal. So Pennsylvania was getting lots and lots and lots of attention. The candidates were coming through with great frequency, lots of advertisements. And so in 2004, there was no way that I was going to vote in South Carolina. No way. And so in 2004, when I was in college at South Carolina, I came back on the weekends. I drove 9 to 10 hours back to Pennsylvania. I attended Kerry rallies. I attended Bush rallies. I did everything that you could think of. On election day, I drove back 9 hours, placed my vote, and I went back. Yes, I know I could have placed an absentee ballot, but that's no fun. Okay? So some states are completely ignored, while a handful of states get all of the attention. You can think of this as a problem. Second, small states in the Electoral College receive disproportionate influence. So they may not get attention. Okay, so those small states, if we look back to our map, the small states in terms of population, so Wyoming, Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Delaware, these small states, they don't get attention because by and large they are safe states, but they do have disproportionate influence. So they may not have the attention, but they have a stronger influence over the outcome. So what I mean is that the 8 smallest states in terms of population, have about 1% of total population of the American society, but they have 5% of the electoral votes. So they have a disproportionate influence. Third complication of the Electoral College is that electors in all states are not bound to follow the popular vote of their states. So you go, you place a vote, you want the electors from your state to vote for Hillary Clinton. There is no federal law, there's no federal provision that forces the electors from your state to place their vote for Hillary Clinton. Now, electors these days make pledges. States try to institute provisions to try to make the electors follow popular vote, but there's no federal mandate that forces that to be the case. Okay. A fourth complication here is a potential situation where no candidate receives the majority of electoral votes. So you could have a situation, especially if multiple candidates are running. So if you have 4 candidates running, 4 candidates receiving electoral votes, you could have a situation where no one of those 4 candidates receives a majority of electoral votes. And in that case, the House chooses. So if no candidate receives a majority of electoral votes, the House of Representatives chooses on the basis of state delegations. So instead of each individual representative voting for a president, the 18 representatives from Pennsylvania have to get together and make a selection for one of those 4 candidates. Okay, so if no majority, the House decides as delegations. Another potential situation that could occur is when one candidate wins the popular vote, but a different candidate wins the electoral vote and therefore the presidency. And this has happened 3 times in history. 3 times in history. The most recent time was in 2000. And in 2000, what happened was you had the election between Bush and Gore. And Gore received more popular votes, so he received more votes, more absolute votes across the country. But Bush received a majority of the electoral votes. So what was happening was that Gore, in the states that he was winning, Gore was winning his states by large margins, therefore driving up his popular vote. So Gore's winning his states by large margins, his popular vote is increasing. George Bush was winning his states, but by smaller margins. So he was getting the electoral votes and not as much toward the popular vote. And so just as recently as 2000, we had this specific situation where one candidate wins the popular vote, another candidate wins the electoral vote, and therefore the presidency. Now, because of these complications, some of which you might think are pretty significant, a number of reforms have been put on the table to try to reform the Electoral College. And the first big reform is to keep the Electoral College, so to keep the process of having electors who have individual votes, but to assign those electoral votes proportionally. So what I mean by that is, let's say that Hillary Clinton and Ben Carson are vying for the 20 electoral votes here in Pennsylvania, and Hillary gets 51% of the vote, and Ben Carson gets 49% of the vote. Instead of Hillary getting all 20 of the electoral votes, like under our current system, if we assigned the electoral votes proportionally, Hillary Clinton and Ben Carson would split the electoral votes 50-50. So Hillary would get 10, Ben Carson would get 10 as well. So a proportional distribution. A second potential reform would be also keeping the Electoral College and the electoral votes, but basically using the process that Maine and Nebraska use. So you distribute the electoral votes by congressional districts. So each congressional district has 1 electoral vote. Whoever wins that congressional district receives the electoral vote from that district. And then whoever wins the popular vote in each state gets the 2 additional votes. Now, the third reform is to just get rid of the Electoral College. Just get rid of it completely. So this argument goes, well, this might have been important back in the day, but now it's arcane, it's not something that we need, and so we can just choose the president by popular vote nationwide. So third reform, get rid of the Electoral College. Now, the likelihood of any of these going through is slim to none. Very slim to none. In order to change the way that we elect our presidents, we would have to have a constitutional amendment, and that's pretty tough. It's pretty tough. All right? So, with that, I'm done, and so I would like to ask any of you if you have questions.
I just have a question. How can it be that two states have a different system than all the other states and you can't reform it at all?
So, I'm short. So, electoral law is determined at the state level. So besides what the Constitution says about elections, that the general election has to occur the Tuesday after the first Monday in November, and beyond the Electoral College, all electoral laws are done at the state level. So each state can determine how they would like to run their elections, and Maine and Nebraska just chose a system that's different from the other 49 states. That's all.
Heather, didn't Pennsylvania discuss potentially moving to a system like Maine or Nevada, which would have pushed us into more attention potentially?
I heard something about that, but I'm actually not sure about the specifics. So I'm sorry. I can't respond.
I've picked out certain students who I know have great questions.
Oh, good.
Do you believe a shorter election cycle would be better, or do you believe the longer election cycle that we currently have in place would better serve the candidate?
Yeah. So it's hard to regulate the election cycle, right? It's really hard to regulate. So right now we're not technically in the true election cycle. We're like in pre-election months. But really what we have, because of the advent of 24/7 news cycle, because of social media, right? We're in this constant 24-hour, 7 days a week, every day of the year, for every year, we are constantly campaigning. So it's hard to imagine shortening or getting out of this system. So it could potentially change the way that we choose, but I don't know how we would go about doing that.
Would you suggest any positives? You know, people often forget that the Bush-Cheney team went to Hawaii in 2004, about 24 hours before the election. So the Electoral College must have some positive effects as well, right?
Sure. I mean, the Electoral College does preserve the interests of the smaller states, right? Because they have a greater say over who ultimately becomes the president. Especially whenever you get closer to the actual election, you see some candidates venturing out into the states that lean toward the opposite party. So you do see some positives of reaching out. Now I do want to say, if we were to get rid of the, it says don't touch the microphone, sorry. If we were to just get rid of the Electoral College completely, I think what you would see is that the focus would shift to an even smaller number of citizens, right? So if we were to get rid of the Electoral College completely, instead of focusing on a handful, 7 specific states, instead what you would probably see are the candidates focusing on the largest cities in the country. So it would bring the process down even smaller. So right now, the system isn't perfect, obviously, but it does preserve some influence for some citizens.
Just one more question from
Yeah.
me. Is it possible that the Electoral College could overturn the electoral will of the American people? And isn't that fundamentally one of the things the founders were up to here?
Yeah.
Let's assume, say, we the people, or the delegates choose the wrong candidate.
Yeah, there was concern, right? At the beginning, the big concern was that everyday citizens, everyday Americans didn't know what was in their best interest. And we see this peppered throughout the Constitution, right? We see this at various points throughout the Constitution. And so there was this mechanism, the Electoral College, to try and ensure that there's an outcome that is positive for the nation. Yes, absolutely. So you could have this outcome. Today, I think it's unlikely. Unlikely. Yeah?
Do you want to predict the electoral vote?
No.
Oh, come on.
Electoral vote, okay, if I had to guess, I would say it would be 300 100 for the Democrats, and then very similar to what we had last time, like 206, whatever's left.
So the election is over.
No, not today.
So there's no reason for an election.
You said it, not me.
All right. I think the science says it, not us.
All right. Thank you very much.